Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans, and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of Religion in the American Experience, a podcast of the Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your listening fix, and tell your colleagues, friends, and family about us. Here is what I think an average person may say about Thomas Jefferson. He is the author of the Declaration of Independence, third President of the United States, founder of the University of Virginia, slaveholder, and has a monument in Washington, D.C. and his face on our 5-cent coin, and is one of the 4 presidents carved in stone at Mount Rushmore, along with George Washington, Teddy Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. He has also been called the American Sphinx because a complete understanding of him has been somewhat elusive for scholars and the public at large. For the National Museum of American Religion, our questions are these. What was Thomas Jefferson's religion, his religious outlook, and what impact did these have on him personally and on his public actions? Answers to these questions will give us a better understanding of Jefferson and the American project he helped establish, and equip us to help guide the American experiment in self-government successfully through the 21st century. Thomas Kidd is here to answer these and related questions. Dr. Thomas S. Kidd is Research Professor of Church History at Midwestern Baptist Seminary in Kansas City and a Senior Research Scholar at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion. Kidd completed a PhD in history at the University of Notre Dame, where he worked with the historian of religion, George Marsden. He received a BA and MA at Clemson University. He is a prolific author and has written, among other books, Thomas Jefferson, A Biography of Spirit and Flesh, the focus of today's interview, Baptists in America, A History with Barry Hankins, George Whitefield, America's Spiritual Founding Father, and American Christians and Islam. He has written for outlets including the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Kidd teaches courses on colonial America, the American Revolution, and American religious history. Tommy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. First, can you tell our listeners why you wrote this book? There are so many biographies of Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, I think I wanted to write about Jefferson's religion, but not just his religion. The subtitle is A Biography of Spirit and Flesh, so it's a kind of moral biography of Jefferson. It's answering a question that I think a lot of people have about Jefferson, which is sort of the "how could he" question. He's the one who said all men are created equal. But as you said, he owned slaves and even carried on a long-term sexual relationship with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. And so how did all that make sense to Jefferson, if it did? And I think that taps partly into the question of his own religious convictions and sense of morality. Code of morality. And I think that, like with so many things in American culture today, that people have extreme views on the left and right about Jefferson. I mean, you either have the Jefferson who's sort of, a hardcore secularist and really had no interest in Christianity at all, or you have some on the Christian right who will say, well, no, Jefferson was a born-again Christian, and he was a Christian just like all the other founding fathers. And as usual, I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, or it's more complicated than the popular stereotypes. And it's certainly more complicated than just plugging Jefferson into some kind of partisan stance today. When you get to know Jefferson generally, but specifically on his religious and moral views, there's a lot of things that just don't seem to go together. I mean, he is definitely a skeptic about traditional Christianity, but he's obsessed with the Bible. He reads the Greek New Testament regularly just for personal edification. He prepares his own edition of the Gospels. And so he's not like, a secularist today who might be an atheist and say, well, what possible good could there come from looking at the Christian tradition and so forth. So you just have to kind of hang in there with Jefferson, not try to plug him into some partisan category. And of course, this is what I would say as a historian. You just have to look at him historically and let him speak for himself about issues about religion and morality.
Okay, that's a great intro. Let's jump in. I think you give a good reason to write the book. Let's begin here. You write, Tommy, this early on in the book, quote, "The Bible, Book of Common Prayer, and evangelistic tracts in Peter Jefferson's, Thomas's father, library reflect the deeply Anglican world view in which Thomas Jefferson grew up," close quote. Can you paint the religious picture of Thomas Jefferson's childhood and teen years as best you can for us? What do we know and what do we not know?
So he grew up in a conventional Virginia Anglican family, and I don't think had a lot of resources to develop his skepticism until he was a college student at William and Mary. But in colonial Virginia, the setting in which Jefferson grew up, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, is the established church, so it receives tax support from the government and legal protection. And his father and Jefferson were both leaders in Anglican parishes, vestrymen, which is a kind of lay office for Anglican men at the time. It's as much of a community kind of position as it is a specifically religious position. They're tasked with just supporting the parish and looking after poor relief and things like that in the parish boundaries. But Anglicanism really formed the structure of his family life, as it did, I think, for most planters, the bigger farmers in colonial Virginia. So I think that helps to explain this kind of enduring legacy of Christianity, at least the ideas and structures and rhetoric of Christianity in Jefferson's life, that even though he develops profound skepticism about traditional Christian beliefs, there's still that kind of cultural inheritance that he brings into the era of the Revolution that it would be very hard for him to get away from, given how just wired in Anglicanism was in his childhood. I've also written about Benjamin Franklin on these kind of issues, and I think in comparison to Franklin, Franklin grows up in a Puritan family in Boston, and the Bible itself, I think, is a more profound influence on Franklin, even though Franklin, like Jefferson, goes on to, as an adult, to profess skepticism about Christianity. But Franklin probably knows the Bible itself better than most of the other major founders. But Jefferson knows it really well, too. And as I said before, he shows a lifelong commitment to just private reading and maybe even in his way a sort of devotional life that relates to the Bible. So it's enduringly important. It's not as if Jefferson, goes to college and just gives up on any kind of Christian influence. It's there for his whole life.
Okay. Well, let's talk now about what happens to him religiously when he gets off to college at William and Mary. Can you tell us about the influence of Dr. William Small and George Wythe on Jefferson's religion and religious development? And these two he met while at William and Mary.
Yeah, I mean, at William and Mary, his professors, including ones that you mentioned, are a kind of chief conduit for him to, especially British Enlightenment thought, and more of an emphasis on reason and natural law, natural revelation, rather than the primacy of divine revelation. And I think one of the things that this teaches Jefferson is that it's better to depend on rationality than claims about divine authority and revelation, particularly in the Bible, because he becomes convinced that the Bible just makes claims that are irrational and indefensible. For instance, he would put the Trinity as one of the key points in the Bible that is just it makes no sense to him rationally that God can be both three and one, and so he thinks that God is real. Some people have suggested that Jefferson is an atheist. I don't believe that at all. But I think he's always a theist. But he thinks that anything that the Bible and his professors help introduce him to this kind of rationalist critique of the Bible, that anything the Bible claims, I mean, you can't just believe it because the Bible says it. I mean, you have to test it by the standards of rationality, and he thinks that rationality is a fixed human characteristic. And that's something that I think philosophically people today would tend to disagree with him about. But he tends to think that there is a kind of fixed human rationality that is superior. It stands above and is superior to any kind of claims of divine revelation. And so he would say it's certainly rational to believe that there is a creator God. But things like the idea that God is three in one, it just on its face violate basic standards of human rationality, and so can't possibly be true. So I think college, really helps Jefferson to get comfortable with that kind of, that a sophisticated, learned man would sort of stand on his own, outside of the claims of religious traditionalists and evaluate scripture or church teaching according to his own standards of rationality and learning.
Would you say he became an outlier with that sort of thinking, or was that sort of a trend at that time, where more and more sort of Virginia planters who become educated at, let's say, William and Mary, the college there, sort of adopt similar attitudes and positions?
Yeah, I mean, I think among elites, there's a trend towards more skepticism. I mean, Franklin developed skepticism without ever going to college, but anybody who was able to access texts of the British European Enlightenment more generally could have gotten access to skeptical writings, deistic writings, that could, and deism could mean a lot of different things, but it usually meant skepticism about traditional Christianity. I do not think that those kind of views were very popular among just rank and file Americans. But when you look at the top tier founding fathers, of the ones that we can tell what they believed, and Franklin and Jefferson are two of the easier ones to be able to tell. It's harder to tell what, say, Washington and Madison believed, but John Adams is another example of it. They're at least heading in the direction kind of Unitarian Christianity, which would be anti-Trinitarian and very focused on morality and ethics rather than supernatural claims about, God's role in the world. The idea is, Christianity is a very simple religion, and it's focused on Jesus's ethics, and especially principles like, the golden rule and do unto others what you would have them do unto you. That's what it means to these people to be a Christian.
Okay, helpful. What was Jefferson's role in Virginia's 1774 Day of Fasting, and what does it tell us about his early religious outlook?
So one of the things that's surprising about Jefferson is that as a legislator and executive in government, he pretty regularly, not as president of the United States, but as governor of Virginia and in the Virginia legislature or the Patriot Assembly, he pretty regularly will do things that seem, at least participate in things that seem to be at least claiming kind of divine sanction for what they're doing in the resistance and then revolution. But in some cases, issuing proclamations that seem just outright Christian, which, if you assume that Jefferson is just a hardened skeptic, it would be strange to imagine why he would be doing this. But it was very common at that time, at times of crisis, for legislatures to issue days of prayer and fasting. That was just the practice going back for centuries in Anglo-American legislatures, that you would call on the people to pray and to fast and to ask for God's help and protection. And so he was involved with that very directly, and he talks about rummaging around an old Puritan prayer declarations of prayer and fasting, and so they found enough to be able to write one of these things up. And I think if we think, well, how could Jefferson do that? Or if we think, well, he must have just been totally manipulative about doing, he was expected to do this or something. I think we're missing that he's a conventional political leader of the 1770s and 80s. And this was just as common as anything for them to do. And I think Jefferson, feels like he's, he represents a broadly and often deeply Christian people. And so this is just the sort of thing that you do as a legislator. So that's where that sort of thing comes from. He is quite conspicuous as president that he will not declare days of prayer and fasting.
Right.
And I think some of that is indicating, his inclination to not do that, but it's also that he thinks that's really for the states to do rather than the national government, and that it might indicate having an established religion if you, as the national government, proclaimed a day of prayer and fasting. So I think he, at a minimum, would just prefer to leave that to the states when he's president.
Right. Okay. And we'll touch on that a little bit later, but you're right. As president, he didn't. And it looks like a lot of it had to do with establishment of a national church, and he didn't want to see that. Jefferson wrote about an evangelical friend that, quote, he had proved his religion genuine by its harmony with the liberties of mankind and conforming his public prayers to the spirit and the injured rights of his country, close quote. Jefferson later wrote that the progress of liberty and the decline of tyranny proved that there is a God in heaven. This linking between religion and liberty seems to be a theme of his religious sentiments, at least from what I read in your book and other places. Can you tell our listeners more about this? Am I accurate in saying that?
I think Jefferson and a lot of the founders made a very close connection between liberty and true Christianity, and they believed conversely that false Christianity promoted tyranny and oppression. And for Jefferson, that was particularly when you have a close linkage between church and state. And of course, at the time of the Revolution, the founders are always very quick to criticize Catholic countries as having way too close connections between church and state. And so They would constantly be saying, in what popish countries is what they would call them at the time, that you just have Christianity serving as an agent and a tool of oppression, but that the spirit of Christ in truth is a spirit of freedom, of liberty, and certainly allowing people to not be free from government coercion in matters of religion. And it wasn't just Jefferson who thought that. I mean, there were a lot of traditional Protestants who believed that as well. And in particular, Baptists at the time of the Revolution were quite keen on a full-blown separation of church and state so that the church could operate in freedom. And they were quite enthusiastic in their support of Jefferson because of that commonality, that connection that they made about religious liberty, where a lot of other founders, people like John Adams and George Washington, Patrick Henry, thought that there should still be a connection between church and state, because if Christianity is really important to the life of the republic, that the government should at least support the general interest of Christianity. And then that was a kind of classic debate among the founders. But yeah, I mean, Jefferson thought that true Christianity would certainly promote liberty, not coercion, and not ever be connected to the state, such that they would be coercing people into religious belief or practice.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. What do Algernon Sidney and Hebraic republicanism have to do with Jefferson's religion and the Declaration of Independence, which you point out in your book has played an outsized role in American civil religion?
Yeah, so that reference to Sidney, I mean, one of the places that he talks about Sidney, who was an English Republican, smaller Republican writer in the 1600s, is a letter he wrote late in his life about the sources that he used for the Declaration of Independence. And, some of the figures he cites are just familiar figures, at least to political theorists, from Greek and Roman antiquity, people like Cicero and things like that. But then he lists Sidney, which I think in that list was probably the most obscure name to people today. But Sidney was a kind of a radical Republican writer in the context of the English Civil War and the upheavals in the mid 1600s. In England, and Sidney was one of a small group of English writers in the 1600s. John Milton is another one who's better known as a poet than a political writer. But they were people who proposed that God's original intention for his people was to have a republic, not a monarchy. And that's when I say small or Republican, I mean people who support a Republican form of government instead of a monarchy. And where they get this idea is when Israel, and Sidney writes about this, when Israel asked for a king in the book of 1 Samuel, that they asked the prophet Samuel, we want a king. Everybody else has a king, so give us a king. And Samuel says, you don't want a king. A king will abuse you, and and he'll even raise high taxes on you, and you won't like it at all. And they say, no, it'll be great. Everybody else has a king. Give us a king. And so people like Sidney say this is a signal that God never intended Israel to have a monarchy. It's not exactly an airtight argument, since the other parts of the Hebrew Bible have glorious things to say about godly kings, including David and Solomon. It's a pretty easily refuted argument, but it comes back up with enormous force in the American context, when Thomas Paine argues in Common Sense that that same thing, that in First Samuel, that God had registered his disapproval of monarchy, and that is why Americans should reject George III and declare independence. And that's the most important. Paine's Common Sense is the most important argument made along these lines. And so for Jefferson to say that that Americans should reject George III, that he's been abusive and he's a usurper, and that they should return to the free and equal situation that they have in the state of nature. He's drawing on Sidney and other writers, in that kind of Hebraic Republican tradition, of implying that this is part of God's original plan, that we not have a king. And again, even John Adams said that argument was ludicrous. He said this is just bad biblical interpretation. I mean, Adams supported independence, but he thought this idea that the Bible doesn't support monarchy was just silly. But it points out that people, even skeptical people, knew that if you were going to do something as big as declaring independence and repudiating the British monarchy in Parliament, that you really needed some sense of at least God might approve of this sort of thing. And there might be something fundamentally biblically wrong with monarchy. That was very helpful to the argument. And so, Jefferson in that letter just sort of drops Sidney's name, but doesn't really explain what he meant. But, Jefferson had Sidney's book that we're talking about in his library, and Sidney was very well known at the time, even though he's largely forgotten today. So it just tips us off that people like Jefferson and Paine were drawing on some deeper English roots that, again, were making Christian arguments about politics and the ideal political arrangement.
Okay. That's a good story that I don't think a lot of people know. As you say, Algernon Sidney's name is not well known, but it sounds like his arguments were at least in the minds of some of those founders, Jefferson included. What do we learn about Jefferson's religious outlook when he wrote in 1786 that, quote, he was not sure how the workings of an overruling providence would deliver the enslaved people from bondage, but he figured it would come either through the spread of enlightened ideas among owners or by God's exterminating thunder, close quote.
Yeah, I mean, Jefferson, in Notes on the State of Virginia in particular, which was his only full-length published book that he ever came out with in the mid-1780s, says pretty shocking things about the judgment of God, and the threat of the judgment of God on America because of slavery. And it's shocking on a couple different levels. One is that it's probably the strongest indictment that Jefferson ever made of slavery's immorality. Again, as he's a slave master himself. And then for him to speak about God's providential engagement with the issue of slavery, that God might come in and judge in some disastrous way America because of the sin of the slaveholder. It just doesn't sound like something that Jefferson would normally say, and he doesn't. I mean, he's usually very cautious about ever implying God's providential work in history, but he does in that case. And I think it tells you a couple things that I don't think that Jefferson is a strict anti-providentialist. I mean, he's often called a deist. He doesn't call himself a deist. Franklin does call himself a deist, but Jefferson doesn't call himself a deist. I think that's an okay label for Jefferson, but I don't think he's strictly anti-providentialist. Like, we think of classic deists being sort of, having this idea that God wound up the world like a clock and then just went off and is doing something else now. I think Jefferson, if you get him in the right moment, he'll say that God does things providentially in human history. And then Jefferson, he doesn't normally insist on the point as much as he did in that passage that you read and elsewhere in Notes on the State of Virginia. But he's pretty clear, especially early in his career, that slavery is wrong. That it's immoral. But he says later in his career that we have the wolf by the ear with regard to slavery. He says, we can't safely hold on and we can't safely let go. So we're in a bind. It's just, what he says is that if, say, for instance, you just had blanket emancipation of slaves all at one time, he believes firmly that it will lead to a genocidal race war between whites and blacks. And so, of course, he doesn't want that. And he becomes even more terrified after the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s, in which African Americans, free and enslaved in Haiti, overthrow the French authorities and create an independent black-led government. I mean, Jefferson is just terrified about something like that happening in America. So he's in a bind. He knows that slavery is wrong. He even seems to fear somehow that maybe God will allow a slave rebellion to happen in America if whites don't try to, say, gradually emancipate slavery or something like that. But he's clearly troubled about it. But for the most part, he won't agree to legal reform on the issue of emancipation. He does sign off as president on the prohibition on further imports of slaves in 1808, and that's an important move. But it's sort of the last time that Jefferson does anything. I mean, he retires from politics fairly quickly after that, and but when there's talk about, say, restricting the spread of slavery in the U.S., he won't put up with it at all. So he's really, really complicated about the issue of slavery and what God thinks about it.
Is there any indication in the historical record that he feels, so viewing his words in that book, Notes on the State of Virginia, about the possible judgments of God coming in, right? God angry with slavery. Is there anything in the historical record that indicates he personalizes this and feels God's judgment about him and his slaveholding?
I don't think so. And he's much more focused personally on the fact that he is starting with. I mean, he inherits a major lot of land and slaves and debt from his father-in-law in the 1770s, and from that point forward, he is always in deep financial distress, and his lack of financial discipline personally, and he's not a very profitable farmer. The hole gets deeper and deeper through the 18 teens and 20s. And so I think he would be exasperated by any suggestion, that he should do something about his own slaves, because he would. I'm just trying to remain solvent. I mean, I'm trying to keep my creditors at bay. So I can't possibly do anything about freeing my own slaves, and that would be his justification. And so when he dies, he does free a very small number of the slaves that he was the closest to, and then a couple of his, we assume, children by Sally Hemings. But other than that, his creditors or basically in control at the time of his death, and so they sell off hundreds of his slaves to help pay off his own personal debts.
Okay. So what do we learn, Tommy, about Jefferson's religious outlook when he proposed the national seal being the children of Israel in the wilderness led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night?
Yeah, that's another surprising episode if you think of Jefferson as being somehow fundamentally anti-Bible or anti-religion, that he and Franklin thought that an image from Exodus was just right for representing the new nation, and so you don't ultimately get that as the national seal. I mean, that's striking too, that they're proposing a scene from Exodus, but Congress, for a variety of reasons, not necessarily opposition to an Exodus image per se, but that image is not adopted. So Jefferson and Franklin are a little bit of outliers about wanting a biblical image for the national seal, even though Jefferson and Franklin are certainly among the most skeptical of all the members of Continental Congress and the early Congresses. So it's really surprising that they would want that, but it speaks, I think, to that they certainly had. I've already said that they're so deeply influenced by just the text and stories of the King James Bible, but at least in a kind of literary sense, they think that the Exodus of the freeing of the Israelites from Egyptian slavery is such an apt metaphor or trope for the American experience in struggle for independence and liberty, that they would have absolutely no qualms about it being from the Bible. I mean, this is why you would choose it, is because it's from the Bible to them. But it is forgotten largely just because we didn't choose that as the national seal. But it's quite striking that when their first suggestions are to have that biblical image.
Right. In discussing religious disestablishment in Virginia in your book, you share that Jefferson often used Jesus's words such as, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. It feels like religious freedom, like liberty and religion, it feels like religious freedom was an important part, almost an official part of Jefferson's religion. I don't know if that's an accurate way to put it, but that's sort of one way I put it together. Tell us about religious freedom and Jefferson's religion.
Right. Well, Virginia, again, coming into the Revolution, has an official colonial established church and state church, the Anglican Church, which comes to be called the Episcopal Church after the Revolution, because Church of England didn't sound very good anymore. So there's a promise in 1776 in the Virginia Declaration of Rights that Virginians will have freedom of religion, but to the founders, freedom of religion didn't necessarily mean that you would have an end to state support for religion. I mean, there were people like Patrick Henry, for instance, who was Jefferson's great rival in politics in Virginia. Henry thought you can still have state backing and tax support for religion, but we'll just stop persecuting any dissenters. So there's a formal support by the government for Christianity, but we won't persecute anybody for their religion anymore. Which was sort of Henry's solution was sort of a middle of the road kind of solution at the time, because now he's okay with not having the Anglican Church be the only established church, but he would say you've got to support, but you've got to require people to pay taxes to support churches. But maybe we can have people just designate the denomination that they go to or believe in. Jefferson thought that was a mistake, and that you should have full religious freedom, which for him entailed getting the government just out of the business of promoting Christianity, but any kind of religion. He didn't want government to be hostile to religion. It just don't mess with it. Just don't leave religious groups alone. Leave individual citizens alone to determine, with their own conscience and between them and God what they believe. And I think you're right. That is one of the main tenets of Jefferson's own religion, is that the mind has to be free in order for your religious beliefs to be true and real and authentic, and that the government should leave people alone to determine that for themselves. And so that was, the kind of the radical end of what religious liberty would look like at that time. But, and I've suggested this already, but he got a lot of support from non-Anglican evangelical Christians in Virginia, especially Baptists, who had been badly persecuted by the official Anglican denomination and their government supporters. There were dozens of Baptist preachers who had been put in jail in Virginia in the 1760s and 70s for illegal preaching. And so when Jefferson said, I just want the government to get out of the business of religion, just let people preach and believe or not believe, and just let the government just leave them alone. And if they protect anything, it's just protecting the free exercise of religion. Baptists love that, because their argument was just, leave us alone so that we can worship God and preach the gospel and try to convert people, and just let us do that. And we don't need any government denomination. The government denominations always mean persecution. And Jefferson agreed with that, not because he wanted to convert anybody. I mean, if he wanted to convert anybody, it was to this kind of enlightened rationalism. But of course, he wasn't going around proselytizing people the way that Baptists were. But Jefferson knew that, a lot of established churches, if they knew, for instance, he didn't believe in the Trinity, or that he didn't believe in the resurrection, they would persecute him for that, just like they persecuted Baptists for their illegal preaching. So it was sort of this wonderful, and of course I teach at a Baptist seminary now, and then previously taught at a Baptist university at Baylor. So I'm coming from a location on this, but it's a sort of wonderful, and from today's perspective, kind of improbable synthesis between, I guess you would say, a sort of religious liberal and then evangelicals on the issue of we just don't want the government involved in religion. And that's sort of the founding moment of religious liberty in America. And so that all culminates in the adoption of Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom in 1786. Madison pushes it through the Virginia legislature because Jefferson's already gone off to Paris as a diplomat. But it's stunningly modern, the bill for establishing religious freedom is, because it just says you won't have to pay taxes to support religion. You're not going to be forced to attend church. You're not going to be forced into any kind of religious observance. You're not going to be civilly disadvantaged because you believe this or that, but you'll be free to believe, not believe, attend or not attend, and the government will protect you in doing that. And that's what Jefferson wanted, but it's also what lots and lots of evangelicals wanted in 1786. I find that to be kind of one of the most happy moments of the whole founding era, is that kind of broad consensus, not universal, but broad consensus that just get the government out of the business of promoting religion and just let people be free.
I remember reading, I don't think it was in your book, but about this in a little bit more detail, that in Virginia, some people, were persuaded by Jefferson and the Baptists and say, okay, we won't have tax support, we won't have tax-supported churches generally. There'll be no tax for general religion, but we need to at least keep wording in our code that requires officials to be believers in Jesus.
Right.
And Jefferson, he got some, he made some progress, but he wasn't going to give up there. He said, nope, he's got it. Jesus has to be out of the code. I'm paraphrasing here, but is that true that he really pushed, Madison and others pushed until it was all out, right? No more religion involved.
Yeah. Right. So we're talking about religious tests for office holders. Right. And Virginia dispenses with that as of 1786. And then the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, also says, no religious tests. Again, Jefferson and Madison wanted that, but the Baptists also wanted that because they just were allergic to the idea of the government having any kind of test or just even the technical terms, they would say, we don't want the government to take cognizance of religion. So it's just don't think about religion, don't do anything about religion, just protect freedom of religion, and then we'll take it from there. So it's not as if, Jefferson and Madison have their opinions about Jesus. The Baptists obviously are constantly proselytizing people to believe in Jesus for salvation, but they want to get the government out of just do not pay attention to this, because if the government gets involved, it corrupts religion. So we don't need the government, imposing standards of so. Yeah, I think from today it can come off as more anti-religion than it actually was. I think it's a very modern view of kind of secular government. That's definitely true, but not anti-religion. Right. I think especially for the Baptists, the emphasis is on freedom of religion, so that we can be, just full-blown evangelicals and proselytize and tell people to believe in Jesus, and the government will just leave us alone.
Right. Okay. Helpful. Let's see. During his presidency, Jefferson, surprisingly, from some perspectives, supported a treaty with the Kaskaskia Indians that would provide the Catholic Church with government money to support priests, because so many of that tribe had joined the Catholic Church. You write that, quote, despite his skepticism about evangelical piety, Jefferson assumed that the spread of Christianity would stabilize the frontier, close quote. Tell us more here.
Yeah, it's. I don't want to make too much out of this. I think some people have talked about this somewhat peculiar episode with the Kaskaskia Indians and said, Jefferson doesn't believe in separation of church and state at all, which clearly he does. But I think it is definitely true that Jefferson is not as consistent about church-state separation as we might expect him to be. And this is sort of it may be the most extreme instance where he signs off on this bill that is providing money. People have disputed about, well, it was just money that was already promised in earlier agreements and stuff. But the bottom line is he's signing off on it's okay for national tax money to be used to help pay for priests and church buildings among the Kaskaskia Indians. And it's fulfilling this treaty obligations to do that. And if you think of Jefferson as hardline, strict separationist on church-state relations, he just wouldn't have done this. And like I said, you don't want to overstate it. It is an outlier. He's not doing this kind of thing. He's not proposing that tax money always be going to different churches and so forth. He won't declare days of prayer and fasting. So there are definitely ways in which He obviously practices what he preaches about church-state separation, but he also regularly hosts what are basically church services in government buildings as president, and attends these services. So he's not as rigid, I think, as you might expect him to be. I mean, he's more pragmatic about these kind of issues. And so in the case of the Kaskaskias, it's part of the treaty that was worked out with them. It's something we've agreed to. And he does, like you say, I mean, he associates the spread of true Christianity with what they would call, civilization at the time. So he would think that for the Kaskaskias to be learning about Christianity and even becoming Catholics, which, Jefferson was certainly no fan of Catholicism, but adopting some form of Christianity is better to people like Jefferson than having no Christianity at all, because good Christianity to Jefferson is progressive and leads to an ethic of love and charity and all these kinds of good things. So he would have understood the value in that case of introducing Christianity among Native Americans. So it's a very strange case, and surprising that Jefferson would do it, but he didn't seem to give it that much thought or agonize about whether this was appropriate given the First Amendment.
Thank you for that, and for some of the things you mentioned regarding how he behaved once he became president. Anything else you want to say about what he did when he became president relative to religion and church state? Anything else that would be helpful for the listeners? Because it was somewhat, different than once he became president. He behaved in some ways, it seems, different than people might have thought.
Yeah, I mean, he really was. I mean, among all presidents, he was quite firm about not being willing to declare days of prayer, Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is probably what we're the most familiar with. Is Thanksgiving in America today has become secular, maybe optionally religious, but as far as a national holiday, but it is in its origins a religious thing for a legislature to call for a day of Thanksgiving to God. Washington had done that. Adams did it. Jefferson said it's not fit for the national government to do that. Madison tended to agree, but then in the War of 1812, he sort of capitulated and started declaring days of Thanksgiving, fasting, and prayer again, which he then in retirement Madison said he regretted doing that. And then it became pretty standard, at least to be declaring days of Thanksgiving that were overtly at least theistic. And then during the Lincoln administration, the Thanksgiving holiday became an annual thing, that it was being proclaimed every day or every year. And so Jefferson really is an outlier on the more separationist position for doing that. But again, I mean, he seems to be fine with, he would have, including evangelical Baptists, come and give sermons in government buildings, and many times they were pastors who supported Jefferson. I mean, he's not going to bring in these preachers who can't stand him, of which there were many. But I mean, he just didn't seem to think, oh, well, because of the First Amendment, we can't have church services in government buildings and things like that. So he's much more of a pragmatist about that than if you tried to categorize him like in the mold of just a staunch modern strict separationist secularist. He just sometimes does things that are puzzling.
Okay. You write, Tommy, that the months before and after the Louisiana Purchase witnessed the most decisive season of religious reflection in Thomas Jefferson's life. Tell us about this.
One of the things that is surprising to me about Jefferson's religious journey is that it is not until 1803, 1804 that he really locks into what he believes about Christianity. And by that point, he's about 60, so he's pretty late in life comparatively, and yet here he is going through this kind of moment of religious crisis, decision, and I think up until that point, Jefferson went through phases, but was not sure whether he considered himself a Christian in any sense. And then he begins to read very avidly in Unitarian writings, in particular the writings of Joseph Priestley, who's a Unitarian minister and scientist in England first, and then America. And Jefferson becomes convinced that this kind of rationalist, more skeptical but more ethics-focused view of Christianity is just right for him. So anti-Trinitarian, very focused on Jesus's ethics, almost to the exclusion of the supernatural claims about Jesus and other parts of Christianity, or the Judeo-Christian tradition, as it were. And so it's at that point that he really decides, I am a Christian. And he starts saying things like that, I am a Christian. And so sometimes I think, people who want to claim him for sort of more the Christian right will say, see, he says he's a Christian, and he does not say that he's a deist, which is all true, though it happens at a certain time. But he then goes on to say, I am a Christian in the only sense that Jesus ever wanted anyone to be. And I'm paraphrasing here, but setting aside considerations of Jesus's divinity and being exclusively attached to his morals. So even in that, he's saying, I'm a Christian, but I do not believe in the divinity of Christ. I believe in Jesus's ethics as the superior code of ethics to all others in the ancient world. And that's what I mean when I say I'm a Christian. Now, from a traditional Christian perspective, whether Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, this is not a satisfactory version of Christianity, but that's what Jefferson meant, and he comes to it, I think, pretty late in life. I mean, Franklin, I think, makes his commitments about Christianity at a time when, in his teens, pretty much. I mean, I think, Franklin decides, I don't believe in my parents' faith, and I don't really believe in traditional Christianity, so I'm sort of a deist. And I mean, I think Franklin became more traditional about his beliefs later in life, like a lot of people do. But Jefferson, it just took a long time. But as usual with Jefferson, it's keyed very much to his own reading. And reading Priestley, I think, in particular, is decisive for Jefferson.
Okay. Well, let's see. Just in the interest of time, I have a few more, and then questions, and then the final question where you have the last say, sort of an overview. What do we learn about Jefferson's religion and religious outlook with the University of Virginia, his University of Virginia, and the controversy regarding religion? Anything there important for the listeners to understand?
Yeah, I mean, in his retirement, I mean, this is the most important project of his career after politics, is the founding. I mean, there's political dynamics to the founding of the University of Virginia, but obviously this is seen as an important departure in the history of American higher ed, that you have a non-sectarian school, in contrast to, say, William and Mary, which is Anglican, and Princeton, which is Presbyterian, and Harvard, which is Congregationalist. And now you're going to have a kind of a public school, and people will often describe early UVA as secular, and I know what that means, and it's that there is not a sponsoring denomination. But when you look a little closer, and not surprising given everything we've talked about, there is a strong influence of Christianity, focus on the Bible, focus on the biblical languages. And as part of there was an uproar about, state money is going to be used for this godless university. There were Presbyterians in particular who were very upset about the plans for UVA. And so, Jefferson makes what I think was a good faith invitation to the prominent denominations that they could create houses of study on campus. They didn't do that because they wanted to, focus on their own denominational schools. But I think it would be too much to, especially given just the kind of, this is the era of the Second Great Awakening, 18 teens and 20s. I mean, to just have like an anti-Christian school it's just improbable at the time. But I having said that, I don't want to downplay the fact that to have a school that is not sponsored by a denomination, I mean, it's not totally unprecedented because schools like the University of Georgia are in the pipeline and that inspired by some of the same principles. But we also don't want to overstate the extent to which UVA was going to be, quote, secular.
Okay, good. In his retirement, Jefferson told an inquirer of his religion, this is well known, quote, "Say nothing of my religion. It is known to my God and myself alone," close quote. This seems pretty significant to our effort to understand Jefferson and his religious beliefs. What was he talking about? Why did he say this? What should we read into this? What do we learn here?
He was very allergic to the idea of being identified with any particular religious tradition, though, as I've said, I think he clearly is mainly influenced by this kind of intellectual conversion he goes through to Unitarianism. But even that is not, there's not an institutional connection. He's making a connection to Unitarian writers, most notably Joseph Priestley. So he definitely sees his own religion as an individual matter, that it is not something that certainly the state should be involved in judging, but that also critics, especially people he doesn't know well, he doesn't want them, having an opinion about his religion. But of course, because he's a political figure, his religious views are always getting into the media, especially in the 1796 and 1800 presidential elections. He's accused of being an atheist, which, as I said, he's not an atheist, but that's what they say. And his views expressed in Notes on the State of Virginia are debated, and how heterodox is he, and all that. And so Jefferson is just disgusted by the idea of public debate about his own personal faith, as if this is anyone's business. And so that's what he means when he says, say nothing about my religion, it's between me and God. I think that just epitomizes the way he views everybody's religion. It's highly individualistic, not subject to other people's scrutiny. And in Jefferson's case, he thinks of it as being idiosyncratic in a way, but also just thoroughly rationalist. But he's not alone. I mean, he is part of this kind of transatlantic Unitarian community. It's just that it's not denominational for him. It's just, he says that it's much more purely intellectual.
Okay. Thank you for that. Towards the end of his life, Jefferson wrote to Abigail Adams that their, quote, "next meeting must then be in the country to which deceased loved ones have flown, a country for us not now very distant," close quote. "For this journey," he wrote, quoting Matthew, "we shall need neither gold nor silver in our purse, nor scrip, nor coats, nor staves." Do we know what his beliefs about death and what comes next were?
I tend to think that, Jefferson didn't know for sure. Of course, I suppose many people have at least some doubt about what happens when you die. But I tend to think when he says things like that, I think he really respected Abigail Adams more than most women in his life. So I think we can take him seriously when he says that. But it's probably in Jefferson's case a little more hopeful and aspirational rather than speaking from certainty. Is that it's comforting to think that when you die you'll be reunited with friends and family. I think he probably had the most poignant feelings about his deceased wife, who had died in the 1780s, and by all accounts had a very sweet and intimate relationship with and loved very, very much. I think he hoped that he would be reunited with her, with his children who had died before him. And so I think Jefferson wouldn't have wanted to talk about it publicly, but I think if you had pressed him, he would have said, well, I hope there is an afterlife. I hope it'll be a place where we're reunited with those who died before us.
Okay. Well, here's the last question. Although I'd love to visit with you for a lot longer about what's in this book, but we have to end. As we conclude, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from the book, either in terms of important historical transformations you have charted or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that it's important to do good history. I mean, you can't just use people like Jefferson as sort of cartoon figures in today's culture wars. You have to let them just be who they are, and so at least on religious terms, I dare say most Americans don't know anyone like Jefferson today, and so we need to let him be surprising that way. I mean, how many people do you know who are skeptical about traditional Christianity, but also read the Greek New Testament and also the Greek translation of the Old Testament just for kind of personal edification? I mean, it just doesn't seem, like normal, right? But that's the kind of person that Jefferson is that he's so deeply informed about the Bible, the Christian tradition, so deeply formed by that. His categories of thinking, his rhetoric and everything is just so informed by Christianity, and yet he definitely does not believe in, the most basic tenets of traditional Christianity. So you don't want to say, oh, well, he read the Bible, therefore he must be some sort of traditional Christian. That's not who he was either. So, I think that, and that's a lesson about just history in general, is that you to do good history, you have to open yourself to meeting people and seeing things that are not like it is today. And that's one of the ways that we learn from history is that we're introduced to characters and scenarios and cultures that are different from what it is today. There's a famous saying that the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, and that I think is a great sort of creed for historians and people wanting to understand history. Is that things don't just neatly fit into today's partisan arrangements, and I think if you assume that they don't neatly fit, then you're a lot better prepared to understand somebody like Jefferson.
Okay, you have the last word. We have been talking with Dr. Thomas Kidd, research professor of church history at Midwestern Baptist Seminary in Kansas City, and senior research scholar at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion, and author of Thomas Jefferson, A Biography of Spirit and Flesh. Listeners, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please write a review. Tommy, this has been informative and moving. Thank you for being with us and helping us comprehend the American project better by understanding Thomas Jefferson's religious lives and his understanding of religious freedom and the effects these things had on the American founding and early years and have still today. I hope you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
Thank you, Chris.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.